Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this episode of the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast. My name is Dan Wunderlich. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and today we're bringing you the next installment of our occasional feature called How We Work. On these special episodes, we feature interviews with real-life United Methodists digging into the practical details of how they do the work of church marketing and communications. It's my pleasure to welcome today's guest, Julie Mirlicourtois. Julie is the media director at The Story Houston, a United Methodist church in Houston, Texas. Julie, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thanks for having me, Dan. This is a pleasure.
Well, we always like to begin by having our guests share a little bit about themselves as well as how they got into the work of church communications. And I'm especially excited to hear your story because your resume includes a few names and locations I'm sure our listeners will recognize.
Yeah, and it's not quite the traditional path for getting into church communications, but I'll do my best to tell you the story. So, well, a little bit about me first. I'm married. I have two kids, age 4 and 6, and we moved to Houston, Texas, about 3 years ago, largely to create a little better balance in our lives and find a great place to raise our kids. And we
Mm.
certainly have found that here. Previous to moving here, I spent 15 years working as a TV producer. I started working for Face the Nation when I was in college and right after college in Washington, D.C. for Bob Schieffer, who is an amazing mentor. Shortly after graduation, moved up to New York and worked for CBS for their morning show for 7 years and produced stories all over the world, covered 9/11, the Iraq War, and then very much started to focus in on human interest stories. And that's when I developed more and more of just this love for sharing people's stories.
Mm.
And about 8 years into my career at CBS, I decided to move to Chicago to work for Oprah Winfrey. Her show was going to be coming to an end, but I thought, what an amazing opportunity to produce the last 3 years of the Oprah Winfrey Show.
Yeah.
So that was an awesome experience. I mean, it was just, how crazy can we get? What kind of over the top show can we do to mark the last 3 years of the Oprah Winfrey Show? So that was just a wild ride and an awesome experience. And after that, when she ended the show, I helped launch 3 different shows on her network on OWN out of her Chicago studio. And as she was getting ready to close down the studio and move everything to LA and everyone to LA, that's when I had to really, I had 2 kids at that point, and I had to really
Yeah.
think about where I wanted to raise my kids. And I didn't want to go back to New York as much as I love it. And I didn't want to raise my kids in LA because I knew that I'd just be working around the clock and wouldn't be available to them.
Mm.
So I took, at the time, what I thought was a huge gamble, and we moved to Houston largely for my husband's career. And I didn't really know what I was going to do. I knew that I didn't want to work in local news. I knew that I didn't want to produce oil and gas videos. And outside of that, there's not much in the
Yeah.
media market in Houston. So, but a few months into living here, I was looking for a school for my daughter. And I had my then 9-month-old son in the back seat. And I drove by St. Luke's United Methodist, and I had heard about their day school. And just on a complete whim, I pulled over and started wandering through the hallways, which, if you know my background, I was never raised in church. I was never a churchgoer.
Mm.
But as soon as I walked in, I just felt this incredible peace, and I felt like I had arrived home, and it was just the strangest thing. So I ended up sending my daughter to school there and thought, okay, well, maybe we could check out a church service. Maybe it'd be a good thing for my kids to go to church. So I decided to check out a church service, and somebody told me about the Story Houston. At that point, they were less than a year old, and they were meeting in the gym of St. Luke's United Methodist. And my husband and I checked it out on a Sunday, and it was a little out of our comfort zone. I grew up in the
Mm.
Northeast, and we don't talk about Jesus much in the Northeast.
Yeah.
And, all the singing to Jesus made me a little uncomfortable, but something about it, I just felt compelled to go back again and again. And eventually I was approached by the pastors, Pastor Eric and Giovanna Huffman, and they found out what I do, and they asked me if I would help them with some videos. And for a few months, I just worked on some pretty basic video projects with them, but I really got to see behind the scenes of how they operate. And I think for me, that's how I needed to sort of opened myself up to the Christian faith.
Yeah.
When I saw these incredible pastors who really truly were living everything that they were preaching, it just opened me up to the message. And a few months later, I was baptized. And a few weeks after that, I started working officially for the Story Houston. So it'll be 3 years in April, and it's been one of the most rewarding jobs of my life.
Oh, that's so amazing. That's such a great story, and congratulations on your baptism. Welcome to the family. We're obviously thrilled to have you. And this is such a great message to all of the pastors and church communicators out there, because some of the folks that are listening to this are staff people like yourself, Julie. Some are pastors who are doing this on the side, and getting people involved in this field is in itself obviously a form of evangelism. Of course, part of it is that Eric and Giovanna were walking the walk and talking the talk in addition. So that's so great. Julie, can you share with us a little bit about the community that you all live and work in there?
About the Story Houston community?
Yeah, Story Houston and Houston in general. What is sort of to give our listeners a picture of the community in which you're doing your work?
Interesting. Yeah, well, Houston itself, it's funny when you hear Eric and Giovanna talk about why they decided on Houston, you'd think because we're here in Texas that starting a church is easy and everybody already has some notion of what God, what role God plays in their lives. But what they found
Yeah.
when they moved to the inner loop of Houston, we're inside the Beltway, it's such a diverse community. In fact, I think it's more diverse than when I lived in New York City. I mean, I have friends from all over the world who live here. And so there are a lot of people who have never been to church or have been hurt by church or by their faith of their childhood and don't want to go to church. So they realized that there is actually a huge need in Houston for a church like the Story Houston, whose mission is to inspire non religious Houstonians to follow Jesus.
Mm.
And so, yeah, that's what we do. We have just the most incredibly diverse city and the most incredibly diverse congregation. We have people, because of Eric Huffman's past, where he did struggle with a season of atheism. He really speaks to the doubters and the skeptics. And that's what really spoke to me. And I think that's why we're seeing all of these new faces in church every Sunday, and they feel comfortable walking in and saying, I'm not sure what I believe. I'm not even sure that I believe in God, but I want to hear what you have to say. So it's just the most incredible community. And the Christians who are longtime Christians who are at our church, there's no judgment. They really just, love and embrace these newcomers and help them on their faith journey. And everyone's kind of challenging each other in this really awesome way. And that's what our church is about. And I think Houston is the perfect place for it because there are people who grew up in Texas who grew up going to church their whole lives, and there are people from all over the world who have never had that sort of experience and just comes together really nicely.
Oh, that's great. Well, starting at the 30,000 foot level, how would you describe your approach to the work of communications?
Well, I think for me, I always keep the mission of the church in mind, again, which is to inspire non religious people,
Mm.
um, Houstonians, and now we've cast a much wider net through one of our projects to non religious people to follow Jesus. And so because of my passion for storytelling, that's the majority of what I do. We're still in a startup phase. We still have a really small staff. I don't have all these existing publications that I have to create content for. I don't have to sort of maintain content that's already been created. I'm starting everything from scratch.
Mm.
And so I've really been able to just focus on what I think is the most powerful thing, which is telling people stories. And so that carries through in basically everything we do. And what's really been amazing is that the congregation is loves it's such an authentic group of people that want to basically share some of their darkest seasons and their biggest tragedies in hopes of inspiring other people and helping other
Mm.
people. And so, I mean, every day I hear of another story and somebody willing to share something that just has the power to transform so many other people's lives. And so I guess that's really what I focus on is storytelling.
And what do you think drew you to this type of work? Where did you first fall in love with telling people stories? And I guess, do you have any tips for the church out there that wants to start to shift their communications to make it more story centric?
Yeah. Let's start with the first part of that question. For me, where I became interested, I was so lucky. I had a TV studio in my high school, and I transferred into my high school, and they had no other openings for any electives except the TV studio, and I was terrified because I was so shy. But that's where I learned about television and storytelling. And at that point in my life, I grew up in France and in the US. And so I think I experienced a lot more than most kids had in the town that I grew up in at my age. And it really bothered me that the kids around me didn't really see the bigger world outside of their small town. And so I started doing stories about everything from kids in Africa to, victims of domestic violence when I was in high school, which
Wow.
so that's where I think the passion really grew out of and just continued all these years later. As far as a church that wants to shift to storytelling, for me, it's been really an easy thing at the story because there is such a focus on being authentic and not going to church every Sunday with a big smile on your face and pretending that everything's good if it's not. People are really encouraged to share what they're really feeling, to share their questions, their doubts about faith, the struggles of their own lives. And so it's been a really easy thing to do at our church. I've never, ever asked somebody to share a really personal story at the Story Houston and had them say no. There's never any hesitation. So I think it starts with creating that culture where people feel comfortable. And part of that is because people have seen the work I do, and I do it in a very sensitive manner. And
Mm.
Eric always follows it up with, whether it's we're sharing a testimonial on a Sunday morning or we're putting it on one of our online platforms, there's always just a very intentional message about why we're sharing this story and how we hope it will help other people. So the intention for doing this storytelling is always there too.
I know that so much of art and storytelling is sort of a gut level thing, and obviously with your years of experience, probably you're able to see things in a frame of story. But are there any sort of key things that if we're able to encourage a church member to share their story, are there any effective questions you ask or key things that you listen for in their story to help try to craft it in a way that is effective for the people who will eventually listen to it or read it or watch it?
Absolutely. It's a hard question to answer because it's something that just I've been working on for so many years. It just comes naturally. I guess I would say the biggest thing is figure out who the best person is to interview that person.
Mm.
For instance, Eric Huffman and I have a podcast called Maybe God, and it's an interview style podcast. And just last week, we had a woman, a guest worship leader. Her name is Elisa Turner. She's incredible. She's going to be the next Lauren Daigle, I'm convinced. She was just signed
Mm.
with Integrity Music, and we were so blessed to have her at our church leading worship on a Sunday morning. But afterwards, I asked her if she would do a podcast interview with me, and we sat down, and her story is one of the most compelling and powerful but also heartbreaking stories I've ever heard. She struggled with, well, first she lost her father when she was 20 years old, and he was a worship leader, and just really she says she was a daddy's girl. He was everything to her, and she was out there on the road in Nashville trying to launch her career in Christian music when she found out he passed away.
Oh gosh.
And then shortly after that, she was diagnosed with Lyme disease, and she was bedridden for 6 years.
Oh wow.
And then when she got back out on the road after kind of getting a handle on that illness, she became pregnant, and she found out early on in her pregnancy that the baby was not going to live more than a few hours outside once
Mm.
it was delivered. But she chose to keep the baby and said that God wanted her to be the mother of that child, even if it was just for the 9 months that she was carrying that child. And the baby lived 72 hours and died in her arms. Just, I mean, the most heart-wrenching story. But all this to say, I really thought about, okay, who is she going to feel most comfortable sharing this story with? It's probably going to be another woman. And so I decided to do the interview myself. And I think the biggest thing you can do is, how am I going to build a rapport with this person and make them feel like they're just having a natural conversation with me? So, have really thinking through your interview ahead of time so that you're not just following a script, but really letting the Holy Spirit kind of, be part of the interview as well. And just talking to somebody like they're a friend, they'll really open up to you about their biggest struggles. And when you get somebody to feel comfortable in that setting, that's when you get the best out of them and the most compelling story.
That is so important, and obviously a podcast like this that's more nuts and bolts or kind of teaching. I can do a lot of the interviews, but yeah, when you're having someone really open up and share their heart and sharing a story that you know is going to be impactful, setting them up for success, I think is so critical. And as you said too, the more stories you do, and the more your congregation sees you respecting their stories and respecting the storytellers, it creates this culture in which people see how their story can have an impact on others.
Absolutely, and I'll jump in
Yeah.
and say that this storytelling process, like, I've seen it for so many years have such a healing effect on the people who are telling their stories too, and once you see somebody experience that, maybe they come out about some sobriety issues that they've dealt with, that they've never come public about. It's a hard decision for them initially, but afterwards, they're usually just embraced by this community that wants to support them and lift them up, and it becomes part of their healing process. And then it becomes easier for other people down the road to see how that happens and to want to share their stories too. And going back to the interview thing, I think anybody you're asking to open up about these, very dark sometimes parts of their lives, just having as much empathy towards them as possible. The way you conduct the interview and really like showing I've rarely made it through an interview without crying myself. But just really just putting yourself in that person's shoes and showing them, telling them through your words, through your body language, how much you feel that pain too, just really, really helps create a really natural conversation.
Well, this is a church marketing podcast. And so I want to ask you about you talked about you do lots of different projects. You've mentioned videos, you've mentioned the podcast. Why don't you talk a little bit about them and how they've become tools for your church to reach people outside of those just sitting there in the sanctuary?
So we do so many different projects for different reasons. One of the first things we did when I joined the staff was to create an advertising campaign for movie theaters during the holiday season because tons of people are going to the movies and tons of non-religious people are going to the movies, and we thought what better place to advertise. And so we did a series of 30-second, 15-second, 30-second ads, and tried to think of stuff that was really creative that didn't feel like a church advertisement. So,
Mm,
one year we did a little play on our storytelling and kind of telling little stories. But another year we did a late night spoof where we had all of our musicians singing a country music song. And, it was just one of those things that caught people off guard. And at the end of the ad, you find out that it's a church advertisement. One year we did, actually, this wasn't for the movies, but we Pastor Eric and I came up with the idea of doing a carpool karaoke video.
yeah.
And so we got Dr. Tom Pace, the senior pastor at St. Luke's United Methodist, Pastor Eric Huffman, very well-known meteorologist in town, Cheetah, and a local rap legend, Bun B, in the car together. And we did this awesome carpool karaoke video that ended up making local news because it was so unexpected to see, two pastors in a car with a meteorologist and a rap legend singing some totally absurd songs. I can't even remember what the songs were.
Yeah.
Um, it was so great, and we had a lot of people start coming to the Story Houston because I thought, "Wow, if a church can do something like that and be so lighthearted, then, this is the kind of church that I wanna check out." And so that was really a cool thing that we did. As far
Well, and that's such a critical message that I want our listeners to key in on, is that church marketing isn't just about telling people when and where to show up for church, but a lot of it is telling the story and revealing the culture of your church. Because you all could have just run a 30-second slide that said the story Houston, this address, this time, and people would have just blocked it out. But by doing something that shows the creativity and the fact that your church is fun, some people just can't imagine church being fun. So I think that just in that one little encapsulated story, I think there's so much there.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. I think you nailed it. Then about a year ago, we realized that we just have all these amazing stories to share that could transform lives outside of the church too, and that with a mission of reaching non-religious Houstonians and now, non-religious people in 36 different countries through our podcast, we had to really think of where to find them and going to them. And so I'm an avid podcast listener, and I just thought, what tool to reach people, not just by posting sermons, because we were already doing that. We live stream our sermons on Facebook, on YouTube soon, on our website, but not just posting sermons like a lot of churches do, but sharing stories, and
Yeah.
stories that really push people to think about what they believe as it relates to God and their faith. And so I pitched the idea to Eric to do this podcast interview style. He's also a phenomenal interviewer, and so I just thought there was really something there. So we started exploring that, and slowly, just sort of all the resources just came to us without ever really even asking for it, and it just became
Wow.
clear that that's what we needed to do. And so we launched the Maybe God podcast almost a year ago, and today we have listeners in 36 different countries. We've had about almost 40,000 downloads since we started. And that's with actually very little marketing. So my hope in 2019 is to really get the word out even more about it. This is just through word of mouth. But the really cool thing about it, what we realized is that people might not feel comfortable coming to church on a Sunday if they're still really they just have too many doubts about Christianity or about what they believe. And the church setting is not the place for them to explore those doubts. And so what we're finding is people are able to share with their friends this podcast when they don't even necessarily feel comfortable inviting them to church or sharing a sermon podcast with them. They're comfortable sharing this podcast with them because this podcast is storytelling driven. It's entirely storytelling driven, and everyone
Right.
can see themselves in those stories, and it starts to just get people thinking about what they believe and start conversations. And so now it's really cool because this podcast, we have churches all over the country telling us, oh, we're using this as a tool in our small groups to create discussions. And then we have emails from people who, are agnostic. There's a woman who wrote to us from New Zealand last week. Our episodes on near death experiences apparently had a huge impact in her life shortly after she tried to commit suicide. And
Mm.
she was just so thankful to hear some of the stories, the near death testimonies that we had put out there. So again, it's just an example of how we're always looking for, how do we reach people who are outside of the church? And that's our mission. And it's not every church's mission, but that's where we come from.
Oh, that's great. Well, let's take the time that we have left to get into the nitty gritty of some of the practical things. Are there any apps, gadgets, or tools that you just can't live without?
Oh gosh, it's more about team members I can't live without, honestly. My team members, my more tech I'm not a tech inclined person, which has been the hardest part of the job for me because I don't have this full staff doing all the tech work for me. But so the team members that I do have who can provide that support for me are much more valuable than any of the apps I use.
Where do you do most of your work?
Well, we don't have office space, so I do some of it out of the church in our media booth, which is also where we run slides on Sundays. But I also work a lot at coffee shops. We're very coffee coffee culture at the story,
Yeah.
and I love the energy of coffee shops. I love hearing people talk about what they're talking about around me, and it inspires me quite a bit. So coffee shops probably is my favorite place.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what kind of environment brings the best work out of you, and can you talk a little bit more about why a coffee shop is your favorite place to work?
Well, I need caffeine. I depend on very strong caffeine. So that's probably the first element there. But like I said, I don't know, just something about the energy, the excitement of just all the conversations happening around me. It just for some reason inspires me. And also just anytime I get together with like our core team to brainstorm, it's also about the people I'm around. So anytime Pastor Eric and Nathan Bonus, who's our worship leader, and I get together and just dream up big ideas, that's when I, come up with my best ideas and do my best work.
Mm. Is there any conventional wisdom that just isn't true in your context? Like, is there anything that you might read in a top 10 list somewhere for like best way to reach your community or best way to tell a story that you don't subscribe to?
I thought about this question long and hard, and I don't have an answer for it. Um,
Oh, that's okay.
I'm
That's
sorry.
okay.
Yeah.
What type of content inspires the most engagement from your church members? Would you say it's obviously it's I'm sure it's storytelling in general, but where and how do most of your church members engage with that storytelling?
For our congregation, I would say it's when we wanna highlight a ministry or a story in church on Sunday. That's when, for example, we had a worship night where it was just music, and we had our worship leader do his first original single for the Story Houston band, worship band, and we wanted all the proceeds to Go Ministries, which is a group in the Dominican Republic, and we have teams that go down there every summer, and so we did a video about Go Ministries. We watched it during the worship night, and I think we raised $10,000 that night for Go Ministries. I don't know if I'm answering your question, but I guess I would say when we use the videos to highlight what we're trying to do, people meet whatever need we present.
And do you all end up sharing these videos on any of your social media channels, or do these tend to stay in worship?
We mostly do. The only time we haven't is when we do ones on the prisoners, and the work that we do inside prisons, because we're not allowed to put prisoners' faces out there. But other than that, no, we always try to share it. And actually, that's something, again, since we are a startup and we're kind of creating everything from scratch here. That's one of the challenges that I'm really trying to work on this in the next few months is getting a YouTube channel up and really figuring out. We're launching a new website, really finding easy places for people to access our content. Right now, it's not organized as well as I'd like it to be.
Yeah, you all have had a little bit of viral success. I remember the bluegrass video where you all kind of did a riff on the Jimmy Kimmel songs with children's instruments. And even though I happen to know Pastor Eric and love him and follow his work, it just naturally showed up on my social media feed. So you all have had a little bit of sort of viral success showing up on the news and things like that. But yeah, it's always it's always best to try to find some kind of standard channel to get it out there.
Absolutely. So that's something we're working on. And again, as a small team, I mean, it's just, it takes time, but we're getting there.
Sure. If a church had $100 to invest in outreach, how might you recommend they do it?
Well, I would say if they have good content that they feel good about, I would invest it in a probably some paid advertising on Facebook. We've seen a lot of great results from putting some of our content out there. $50, even on Facebook goes a long way.
It sure does. Are there any books, podcasts, or other resources you might recommend that our listeners check out?
Not for church communications, I would say. I mean, I have very much just continued being inspired by the things that I was inspired by before. Secular podcasts, honestly, Radio Lab and The Daily by the New York Times and heavyweight NPR shows, This American Life. Those are still my inspiration at this point.
Oh, and those are all great, and they can teach us. I've learned so much about storytelling from This American Life, and I'm going to see Ira Glass in January give a talk on storytelling, and my wife
Awesome.
is kind of like, I'll go if you're going, but I know this is more for you.
That's awesome. That's awesome. He's great.
Well, are there any other brands or businesses out there that you look to for inspiration or maybe inspire you when you're feeling stuck?
When I'm feeling stuck, I honestly try to work with my team to come up with just some great new ideas. Honestly, that's usually the best. I feel like when I get the most creative people around me in a room and we just talk through, what we're trying to accomplish, that's the best way to get unstuck for me personally.
Well, and that's great, and that is a wonderful answer because sometimes we're quick to run to Dribble or to run to Twitter or a podcast feed to try to just find something to inspire us, which we usually end up just kind of copying or tweaking. But yeah, finding a team that brings the best out of you is certainly probably the best way to create original ideas. Can you just give them a shout out? Who's a part of your team, and who do you rely on to help you motivate and create these ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's interesting because of just what I do. Before I started working for the Story Houston, I did dabble a little bit in the freelance production world in Houston as I was trying to figure out what my place was here. And I created these amazing relationships with incredible directors, camera guys, an editor. Her name is Brittany Holland, who I couldn't do what I do without her. So none of them are actually officially on my team. I work with contractors largely, and most of them never really went to church before, and that's okay. But they're so jazzed about helping me with these projects, and doing this really cool stuff that's changing lives. So I guess all that to say, sometimes looking outside of just people who have worked in churches their whole careers and finding people who have something fresh to offer, that's really worked really well for me. So Brittany Holland is my incredible editor for every video I do and every podcast episode we do. It was actually hilarious when I told her we wanted to do a podcast. She's like, "But I've never edited a podcast." And she's like, "But why not?" And so she taught herself all the new programs to edit for audio, and she has just done an incredible job. We get so many compliments all the time on how well edited that podcast is and what difference that makes. Also, Mark Calver is a director and camera guy who moved here from LA. Didn't really know, similar to story to me, didn't really know where he'd find his place in the Houston production world, but he's directing our live stream on Sundays now, and shooting most of our videos, and he's been awesome. He also does oil and gas videos and all sorts of other stuff on the side. Aubrey Snyder is kind of a funny story. He walked into church one day, and I don't even know why he walked in, just to check us out. And I was like, "So what is it that you do, and why are you here?" And it turns in he's trained in coding. He does coding, right? But now he's like my right hand. He is like everything technical at the church he now manages, and all these people I could not live without. Pastor Eric is one of the most creative people I've ever met, and is he just sometimes he'll just plant a seed of an idea, and like that bluegrass video that you talked about, or the carpool karaoke video, he kind of plants a seed. What if we did something like this? And at first I think it's crazy, and then the idea kind of develops in my head, and I'm like, that's brilliant, and it turns into this great thing. And Nathan Bonus, who is our worship leader, I am like so grateful to have a worship leader who also just sees the benefit of church marketing and communications, and who just has such a passion for all the same kind of stuff I do. Those, I'd say, are the people that I couldn't do any of this without.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, Julie, if anyone wanted to follow your work or the story in Houston, or if they wanted to reach out and say hi or ask a question, what's the best way for them to do that?
Absolutely. Well, they can go to our Facebook page, The Story Houston. That would probably be the best place at this point to get the most up to date information. In January, our website will be relaunched and a little more current, and that's thestory.church. And I'm also on Facebook if they wanted to reach out to me there.
Awesome. Well, Julie, thank you so much for your time and sharing out of your experience today.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate all your time.
And now, listeners, we want your help in spotlighting the ministries in our church that are making a difference in their communities through marketing and communications. So we want to hear from you. We want to know who to interview and what we should ask them. You can email us at podcast@umcom.org. And of course, you can use that email, podcast@umcom.org, to send us any feedback or topic suggestions you have for the show. We always love hearing from you. Finally, if you found this podcast to be helpful and you'd like to make sure that other church communicators like yourself find this resource, the two biggest things you can do are share this episode with your friends and colleagues and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Google Play Music, or whatever service you're listening to us on right now. Thanks again for listening to the MyCom Church Marketing Podcast.